Welcome, everybody. I'm Deborah Tomlinson with Inside the Vatican Pilgrimages, and we welcome you to the second part of the Shroud of Turin, presentation given to us by our friend, Mr. Jim Bertrand. For those of you who were not with us yesterday, I'd like to give a brief introduction so you know just how accomplished our virtual pilgrimage host is today. Jim and his wife have been married for 36 years and have 6 children. They are members of St. Peter's Parish in Lincoln, Nebraska. He has given 196 of these presentations across 12 states, 18 dioceses, and seen by over 16,000 people, including the Eucharistic Convention of 2016 in Auckland, New Zealand. Besides dozens of parish settings, he's also shared the message of the Shroud with universities, religious communities, three seminaries, men's and women's prisons, and many other venues. He is a certified presenter for the American Confraternity of the Holy Shroud, and he wants you to know that he does not make any money from this endeavor. So this is a passion of Jim's. He shares it with everyone, and for those who were with us yesterday, we can all say that this seems to be the case. Everyone just truly enjoyed it. And so we're very grateful, Jim. We are also being broadcast live on Facebook, so we welcome to all of our fellow pilgrims out there in the Facebook land. And for those who don't know, you can see some of our former virtual pilgrimages on our YouTube channel, and that's Inside the Vatican Pilgrimages at YouTube. And that's the name of our channel, Inside the Vatican Pilgrimages. If you subscribe and ask for the alerts, you'll be given notification when we put new ones up. We also do highlights. This particular pilgrimage, this series, part 1 and 2, will be up in a few weeks. So thank you again for joining us. And now I'd like to turn it over to our guest host, Jim.
Thank you, Deb. And I want to thank all of you for your attentiveness yesterday. It was a blessing to be with you. You had some excellent questions that you posed. And I had a chance to review the chat text box later and saw that Rosemary gave a very helpful suggestion. And she asked if I could repeat the questions, because when people ask those, not everyone can hear when someone else comes on to ask a question. So that was a good suggestion, Rosemary. I will try to do that today, right? Today, you're going to have time for more questions in terms of there'll be fewer slides, but more time for interaction. Now, yesterday, we got oriented with just what we're looking at on the Shroud, and we covered many of the features of the Shroud and the first 19 centuries of its history, so to speak. Today, we're going to cover the rest of the story. And so as we head into part 2, today is also day 10 of my novena that I prayed for all of you that will receive the graces the Holy Spirit wishes to send us and impart to us during this next hour. So we begin with a more recent history of the Shroud. 1978, and enter the Shroud of Turin research project. Right? This was an endeavor headed by the man right there on the left there. That is Dr. John Jackson, an Air Force physics professor from the Air Force Academy. And he and his team were given an extraordinary 120 consecutive hours of access to the Shroud. This had never happened before or since. And this team of 33 scientists worked around the clock in shifts, and they performed various studies with very sophisticated instruments. They worked diligently to try and gather data that might help them answer the question, how was the image formed? That was the whole focus of their endeavor. And the team brought dozens of crates of scientific equipment, literally several tons of it. It included X-ray analysis equipment, infrared spectrometry instrumentation, extensive microscopic and photographic equipment. And to this day, the STIRT project remains the most comprehensive hands-on study of the Shroud ever conducted. And here's a look at the expertise that was involved with that study. I won't read this to you. You can see for yourself. They came from all kinds of areas of scientific expertise. You know, Los Alamos gave us the atomic bomb, Jet Propulsion Lab works with NASA extensively, and they were all specialists from anatomy through X-rays and everything in between. There were only 3 Catholics on this team, and there were also 3 Jews, several Protestants, evangelicals, a Mormon, some agnostics, and atheists, but they were all stars. This was an all-star team in terms of scientific expertise, right? Now, for the next 3 years after they completed their study, by the way, which took place from October 8th till October 12th of 1978, which was sede vacante before there was not a pope during those days, before the conclave. Now, over the next 3 years following the completion of their work, the results of their studies were documented in 20 professional peer-reviewed scientific journals. And then subsequently, a press conference was held and a final summary report was issued. And the STURP scientists were not able to conclusively explain how that image was formed, but they did come to some profound conclusions. So I'll share 3 facts with you from that report. Number 1, there's no paints, pigments, or dyes on any of the image-bearing thread fibers. So there's no stuff to make up the image. It's just there. There's no material to cause that. Right. Secondly, the image is not the work of an artist. And yesterday I covered with you what superficiality we see on the shroud we couldn't duplicate. There's no side images. There's 3-dimensional information. And so they concluded that this could not be the work of an artist. We just don't have the technology to do that. And then thirdly, there are no chemical or physical methods known that can account for the totality of that image. And now here we are, nearly 4 decades after this report, and these 3 facts still hold up. And this is a sign of good science. This has withstood scientific scrutiny and the test of time. We move to 1983. This man you see on the right, King Roberto II, was the last of the Savoys. Remember I told you that the House of Savoy took over the shroud there in the 15th century. And he was the last one. He was at a very brief reign as King of Italy at the end of World War II, from May 1946 until June 1946. Italy was voting on who their next, what type of government they wanted. And his father, Emmanuel III, handed on the kingship to him in hopes that people would want to keep the monarchy going, but the people voted for a democratic government. And so after 1946, this man, the last of the Savoys, was in possession of the shroud, and he lived out his years in Portugal. Now, when he died on March 18th, he had willed the shroud to the Holy See, all right? So in his will, he deeded the shroud to whoever that existing pope was going to be. And so now, for perhaps the first time since St. Peter himself, the successor of Peter, John Paul II, was in possession of the shroud. 1997, the night of April 11th, which was Good Friday. Isn't that a coincidence? A fire breaks out in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. All right, this is the cathedral in Turin where the shroud had been for some 400 years. And the fire is raging above the main altar where the shroud was normally kept. Right? However, the shroud had been moved further back a few weeks earlier because they were doing some scaffolding work up around the altar, and it was anchored to the stone wall there. And this fireman there is smashing away with a sledgehammer to get through the bulletproof glass. As the fire is raging at the front of the church, he's trying to get the shroud out of the church. And it takes quite some time to get a hole big enough to get that shroud out. And after midnight, this picture over here, on Holy Saturday morning, the shroud is rushed out of the burning cathedral. And the next day it was examined to confirm that there was no damage, all right? The cause of this fire was never determined. It was thought perhaps arson. But for the next year, the shroud's whereabouts were kept secret because the custodians of the shroud were concerned someone was trying to destroy the shroud. That was the fire of 1997. 2015, this was the last public display of the shroud in the Turin Cathedral from April through June, right? And it was displayed a couple other times this century. In 2000, it was displayed for the Grand Jubilee, and Pope Benedict XVI displayed it in 2010 when he was Pope. And then, of course, in 2015, Benedict stepped down in 2013, and Pope Francis had it displayed in 2015. And the occasion was, this was the 200th anniversary of Turin's great saint, St. John Bosco. who was born in 1815. And last century, it was only shown 4 times. It was shown in 1931 for the marriage of King Umberto, King of Italy. It was shown in 1933 for the 1900th anniversary of the resurrection. It was shown in 1978. This was the 400th anniversary of the shroud coming to Turin. Remember, it came there in 1578. And then finally in 1998, St. John Paul II had displayed the shroud because it was the 100th anniversary of the first photograph. And it was also in celebration of the year of Jesus Christ, those 3 years leading up to the Jubilee. Now, as we speak, this is where the shroud is at. It is in the St. John the Baptist Cathedral. It is not folded up. It is spread out in this aluminum reliquary. It is hidden away out of sight. There's a very large and very heavy bullet-resistant glass window in front of it here. You can see this. It is in a vault that is temperature and humidity controlled. All the oxygen has been removed. It is full of argon, which is an inert gas. It doesn't react with anything. And there's a team of guards that's on duty 24 hours a day. And so you can come within a few feet of it, but you can't actually access it to look at it, right? So that's where the shroud is at this day as we speak. Now, in dating the shroud, let's acknowledge some of the vast historical and scientific information that I showed you yesterday, right? Beginning with 1355 and working backwards, we had the folding pattern. We had the eyewitness account of Robert de Clary in 1204. We know it was in Constantinople, right on down the line through these artworks, the bloodstains, the chemistry, the pollen grains, the soil from Jerusalem, the geology there, and the fact that we just simply can't duplicate this, all right? However, in spite of all of this coherent information, there is a single rogue item that's separated from the rest of the evidence, all right? A radiocarbon test in 1988 on a very contaminated corner of the shroud dated the shroud to the year 1325, plus or minus 65 years. Now, carbon dating is still used today and it's considered valid in the scientific world. However, I think most people are not aware that about 1/5 of the time, the results are thrown out because of contamination. I'm going to give you some example of some recent carbon dating results that had to be discarded because of their discrepancies, all right? Mummies should be about the same age as their linens they're wrapped in. And yet there are times when mummies are centuries apart from the linen that wraps them. Seals do not live to be 1,000 years old, and yet the carbon-12, carbon-14 ratio sometimes would show that, perhaps because of some contamination of some type. Leaves, leaves come out in, let's say, April, and they're on the ground in November. They're a few months old. We know those leaves for a fact. They're just a few months old, and yet some of them have been dated to 400 years old. And so, these types of examples and others are typical of some of that 20% of the carbon results that are discarded. Now, what about the carbon dating of the shroud? Well, let's talk about the exact site here. Over here on the right, you see the frontal image, and down here by this foot in this corner, this is the area that was used for the carbon dating test. Now, this is brown. Can you see the laser? Because of a scorch from the fire. There's no scorch over here, but this is brown because of handling. This was found to be the most contaminated area of the shroud, and yet that was the site that was chosen. And we enlarge it, and we see it over here. It's about the size of a 3x5 card. Each of these individual samples are the size of a postage stamp. If you want to look at your thumbnail, perhaps less than a square inch, that's the size of these. Now, a sample was given to a radiocarbon lab from Tucson, Arizona. One was chosen and cut off from Zurich, Switzerland. And a third little piece was cut off and given to the lab in Oxford, England. And then a fourth little piece here you see was cut off and given to Arizona because their first piece was just slightly smaller than the others, all right? So this was the area of the shroud, very, very small pieces, all right? Now the problem is that each lab's data did not agree. There was a significant statistical difference in each one of these that amounts to about 91 to 97 years per inch. It gets younger. So that is this piece here, as we move to the Zurich piece, it's 97 years younger than that piece adjacent to it. And this piece right here is 91 to 97 years younger than it. And by the time you get to the middle of the shroud, were thousands of years into the future, right? So something fundamentally strange was going on to produce these results. Now, along with this, when the results were published in Nature magazine in 1989, the red flags went up because people were recognizing this data did not seem to be acceptable. However, in that article, the labs did not publish their raw data. What did the machine say? And they simply published what the ranges that they thought it would be in. And an Italian engineer, Ernesto Bernati, showed that their data was in error and that their chi-square value was not accurate and that this was significant deviation. Well, that's where we were for the last 20 years or so. And then what happened in 2019, a French man by the name of Tristan Casabianca, combined with the work of a professor from Italy, Professor Emanuele Marinelli, they invoked the courts to get to this raw data. It's called the Freedom of Information Act. It is an international law that's present in the European Union as well as the United States. And in 2019, they were able to show, the Oxford lab had to show the raw data it had collected. And that data showed a significant discrepancy from what did they put in that magazine in 1989 to what the data really had showed when they took it. And basically it looks like this. The chi-square value of 1989 was said to be 6.4. In reality, it was 9.2. And if you're not a math person, basically the greater the discrepancy, the less likelihood of that happening. For example, you might be able to flip a coin 10 times and get 8 out of 10 heads. You'd have a much harder time getting that to happen 10 times in a row, to flip a coin and have 80 out of 100 be heads, 20 tails. And so statistically, once you hit 5%, when the likelihood of an event is less than 5%, you are no longer acceptable deviation. It's called significant deviation. And so long story short, this 2019 invocation of the Freedom of Information Act put to rest the idea that the data from the Shroud was in fact in error. It was significant deviation, right? And as a result, the majority of Shroud scientists conclude the following: based on this, that the radiocarbon date does not even provide an approximate age of the calendar age. So what I'm saying is that in the scientific world, the radiocarbon test of 1988 is no longer valid. That is universally accepted as invalid. And so it's not an issue. However, my guess is that in the general population, around most people, many people might still think that this was a piece of evidence that somehow cast doubt on the Shroud. In the world of Shroud research, both for scientists that are favorable to authenticity and even those that aren't, the carbon dating test has been declared invalid once and for all. So that might be some news that some of you haven't heard before, and I can give that to you as basically recorded research in fact. Right? Okay, most people are not aware that there are other means of determining the age of something. There were 3 recent tests in 2015 by Dr. Giulio Fonte of the University of Padua in Italy. And although these testings don't replace carbon dating, they can be used, and when combined together, they may help us out, right? Experiments with these alternative testing methods were conducted in Padua University with actual Shroud thread samples and control samples of threads from private collections and museums in Rome that dated back to the 1st century. Now, these were published in the year 2015 by Dr. Giulio Fonte and Pier Andrea Malfi in that book, The First Century After Christ. And so what I want to do is show you here, all right, and by the way, this has a 95% statistical confidence level. And we're going to look at this in a graph. I think you'll be able to follow this fairly easily. Across the bottom is time here. Can everybody see that? Follow the red laser. There's 1000 BC. There's the 1st century. There's 1000. There's 1500 AD. Okay, so there's time across the bottom. Now, here are these 3 tests that were used to compare the age of the Shroud. In the first one, they take an infrared light, and the way that the light reflects off the sample gives an indication of its age. That's this green area here. It's a pretty wide range. Fourier transmission infrared reflectivity, that's the FTIR. Okay. The second test uses a laser, and it does the same thing. The way that radiation reflects off the image can give an indication of its age. And as you can see here, this is a pretty wide range as well, from about 400 AD all the way back to about 700 BC. This third test is a mechanical test, where they take threads from known samples of known ages and they pull them apart, and then you look at the unknown sample and see how the threads pull apart. This is a mechanical test called the tensile strength. Here is its range. Now, what I'm trying to get to here is, even though these show wide ranges, can you see where they overlap? They overlap in the 1st century. And so my point is that these 3 tests combined together can provide us a more accurate age than any single test by itself. All right, as we head into the home stretch here, you'll find there are 2 major areas of interest in current research on the shroud. All right, first off, we're still trying to answer the question, how was the image formed? And secondly, those missing years, 1204 to 1355. All right, I want to look at the image formation here with you. Oops, there we go. Okay. So we asked the question, how was the image formed? And these hypotheses, 10 of them have been published in scientific peer-reviewed journals. These 10 hypotheses have been grouped into 3 categories, and here they are for you. After each is the name associated with that hypothesis. Was it a natural process alone? There have been 2 theories presented. Was it the work of an artist? There are 6 presented. Or was it some type of radiation event? And that's the 2 here. Now, these 6 you see here, these are the ones you most frequently see on many programs on Discovery Channel, History Channel, Learning Channel, National Geographic, and they tend to occupy much of the airtime, so to speak. But in order for those hypotheses to be valid, they must explain some of these 17 traits I'm going to show you on a chart here in just a minute. For example, some of you, I'll just give you one example of some that have been discarded. This one by Nicholas Allen was very popular because he contended that someone invented photography back before the 13th century, and that if you put a pinhole camera on a linen that was doused in silver nitrate and let it hang for 3 or 4 days, you could get a picture from it, all right? And many problems with that, one becoming that you would lose focus as the body decomposed, other problems. But the most important fact is that in order to get a photograph, you need to have silver nitrate. Silver nitrate is the stuff of a photograph. And when they studied the shroud in 1978, there is no silver nitrate on it. And so that alone discards that hypothesis. And there's many other examples, but in the interest of time, I'll move along here. All right. Now, what I want you to know is that each one of these 10 hypotheses have been scrutinized and examined. And what we did was they put the 10 hypotheses across the top and then 17 features of the shroud down the side and tried to answer the question, how does this hypothesis measure up to what we see on the shroud? So up here we see, here are the 2 natural processes. There's the 6 artists, and there are the 2 hypotheses having to do with radiation. All right, and over here are some of the traits we see on the cloth. This is called the truth table. I don't want to overwhelm you with data here, but I want you to be aware that these have been scrutinized and looked at. The problem is these 2 theories had to be ruled out. That's what those X's are. There are inconsistencies between those hypotheses and what we actually see on the shroud, as well as these 6 artistic creations must be ruled out because of their inconsistencies. All of them fail in the question of superficiality, and many of them, of course, there's no 3D information with these, so those fail because they can't explain the image on the cloth, all right? And I'd like you to just see the rest of the story here. There's 11 other traits on this truth table. These are characteristics related to the body. It's 3-dimensional. All right, there's no wraparound distortions. If you want to have a direct contact theory, it's going to wrap around and your face is going to be a foot wide. So the image itself was not formed by direct contact, so to speak, like say the blood stains. The blood stains went on by direct contact. The image had to have happened from some other process. All right, and my point here is if you look over to the right, all right, you can see over here, these 17 traits can be explained as from a perhaps radiation event. All right, so my point in showing you this truth table is twofold. Number one, to let you know things have been looked at. And number 2, radiation is the only serious area of focus for research today. either by a neutron flux, electrons, or photons of light. Some radiation event, call it the resurrection if you'd like, right? And I'm going to expose for you here the radiation fall-through hypothesis. Now, Dr. Jackson began working on this, and back in 1989, he presented this at the International Shroud Conference in Paris. And he proposed this, and it satisfies all 17 unique image characteristics that we observe on the image and on the cloth itself. It states that the mechanism for the superficial image on the linen fibers is that if there was a burst of light from the body and the body became simultaneously mechanically transparent, then the linen would collapse through this radiant body toward the center of the earth in the plane of gravity, pulling out as it flattens at the top, it will pull out at the sides, resulting in no side images. And this gets us back to one of the first slides that I showed you, what the apostles Peter and John may have seen. The shroud, the long side strip still in place. Remember, they looked inside and believed, right? If this strip was still in place, you would believe. They wouldn't have seen the photographic negative on any side cloth because if it was folded up, that you wouldn't see that, all right? You wouldn't see a photographic negative if it's on the inside of the cloth. But if the cloth was still, if the shroud was still in place with the strips around it, that perhaps might be the reason why they saw and believed. Now, a few seconds ago, I mentioned in that second picture, I said the body became mechanically transparent. Right? What does that mean? We're all familiar with this if we recall how Christ appeared to the apostles on Easter night. The apostles were locked in the upper room in fear. And yet Jesus somehow comes into their midst, even though the door is locked. Now, he had a resurrected body, which was not bound by the physical barriers, the laws of nature. And if we accept that he was able to go through the walls of the locked door, then we've accepted on faith that his body was mechanically transparent. If we believe how Jesus appeared to the apostles on Easter night, we're believing he has this resurrected body that's mechanically transparent. It's not bound by doors or other things. So then the question becomes, when did that moment begin? At what moment did the body become mechanically transparent? If it began at the instant of the resurrection, then this would be consistent with the shroud collapsing through a mechanically transparent body, flattening out as it did so in the plane of gravity, accounting for a vertically aligned 3D image with no side images. And when I say 3D image, I'm talking about the idea that the cloth to body distance would account for these differences in light intensity. You know, the nose is right up against the cloth, it's raised, isn't it? And the eyes are a few millimeters back, they're sunken. When we showed that 3D image of the VP8 image analyzer yesterday. If you wish to see this in more detail, there's a website that we'll look at and show you later, shroudofturin.com. That's Dr. Jackson's website. And you can read his paper. It's complete. It's about 15 pages long with illustrations if you'd like to see that in more detail. So this brings us to our concluding comments here. I invite you to read this by Pope Benedict. You know, each Sunday in the Nicene Creed, we profess our belief in that which is unseen and seen, the visible and the invisible. Well, that which is seen can be understood with reason. And that which is unseen, God exists as the Trinity. We have an immortal soul, existence of angels, heaven and hell. Those unseen realities we understand through faith. And it is through the reason and the faith that we have a broader perspective on reality. So we're left with a situation. Over here on the left, I've summarized the years of many of those things I showed you yesterday. The Sudarium of Oviedo, the public showings, the artwork, all right, down here, the blood types that matched up with the Sudarium and the shroud, the travertine argonite soil, the pollen grains, all right. Those are consistent and coherent over here. And over on the right was the lone carbon dating test of 1988. And we think each of you can come to your own reasoned judgment about which side of the scale carries the most convincing weight. If you wish to know more, I can direct you to this resource here. Right? This is the resource this was the source for the entire talk I gave. Right? Here is 50 years of research, and I'm just trying to hit some of the highlights for you. There's much more to it. And this website will show you, it looks like this. All right. Before I get to the book, though, this might be a teachable moment. If you go to that website, this is the homepage. Look where the cursor's at. Can you see that? Now it says the shroud is 14 feet 6 inches. But if you remember yesterday, I told you it was 14 feet 3 inches. And I said it was 3 feet 7 inches wide. What happened here? Well, 14 feet 3 is exactly 8 cubits. What happened to change this? In 2002, there was a handful of Europeans who thought that the shroud was somehow degrading and disappearing on its own, and that they had to do something. They had to intervene to somehow protect the shroud. And so they initiated what's known as the Shroud Restoration Project. It was highly controversial, and it remains so today. But what they did was they took off the patches, they took off the old Holland backing that the nuns had sewed on in 1534, and they vacuumed the shroud. And a lot of archaeological data was lost in that. And in doing so, this vacuuming stretched out the fibers, so the shroud got longer. The shroud is 3 inches longer today than it was before 2002, and is 2 inches wider. And for that reason, sometimes you might read in some websites or wherever that the man on the shroud is 6 feet tall. Well, no, the man on the shroud is 5 feet 10, but after you stretch the shroud out, it makes him look like he's 6 feet tall. And incidentally, people say, wasn't that 5 feet 10 taller, than the average Jew? Yes, the average Jew, they believe, was about 5 feet 7 in the first century. However, they have unearthed some bones just outside the walls of Jerusalem where bodies that were crucified had been thrown in, and they have found individuals that are 6 feet tall. So 5 feet 10 is taller than average, and people say, how can that be? And my answer to that question is, why does Jesus have to be average? Why would Jesus have to be 5 feet 7? I think it's entirely possible that he had very good prenatal care. And so being 3 inches taller than normal wouldn't be that significant of a problem to overcome. So that's why I was showing you these numbers here, that the length of the shroud has changed after 2002. Now, if you go to this site and then click there, there's a thing called book there. That is where you can get this resource that I had. By the way, I don't get any money from the sale of this book. It was written by Robert Siefker. I had the privilege of being involved in it with a little bit, but this is not a money deal. But I know many of the people watching this would like to know more. And from what I talked about yesterday and today, they'd like to have something permanent they could keep in their hands, because I know I've blitzed you with a lot of information. It would be nice to have this reference so you can get it there. I believe it's somewhere either between $20 or $30, right?
Jim, I have a question, if you don't mind. We received an email from someone who's on today and was on yesterday, Teresa Bell in Canada. She tried to order the book, and apparently the shipping cost from that site is quite high. The book is $20, but I believe the shipping is 45 USD.
Okay, here's what you can do. You've got my email address. You got my email address, and I'll post it up here for everyone shortly here. Have her send me an email, and the book is 20. I have 100 of these. I have 100 myself.
Okay.
And you can send me a check for 25. Give me your address. I'll send it before she mails the check, even if you like. But I would be glad to put that in a brown manila envelope, and I can send her a copy if she wants to send 25 for that. I'll send that donation. That's considered a donation to the Confraternity. And at all the live talks I give, we make the book available for anyone that wants to make a donation. If they make a $20 donation to the Confraternity, then they can take a book with them, and it works very well that way. That answer your question?
That does. Thank you. Do you want your Gmail address in there? I can put it in chat right now if you'd like.
Sure, you can put it in the chat, and I'll put it up on a slide later as well. That's fine.
Okay, so hopefully that answers your question, Teresa, and everybody else. So you can send Jim an email at bsaints2, that's BESAINTS, the number 2, at gmail.com. I've just put that in chat. $25 for shipping in the U.S. I would assume for shipping outside of the U.S., you need to include a little bit more.
Yeah, it's 20, and then I pay about $5 more. So it'll come out the wash. God provides. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Very kind.
We're heading in here to some questions, and we're just about done with part 2 is about over. And then I'm going to be able to share some things with you, answering your questions and showing you some of the open questions that are still there about the shroud. This man you see on the left is Bishop Michael Sheridan of the Diocese of Colorado Springs. And I'm going to finish this with a comment that he made. He spoke at the 2014 International Shroud Conference held in St. Louis, Missouri. And he said this. He said, "Faith is about more than probability. The martyrs did not die because they thought that Christ is probably the savior of the human race. They died in the certainty that he is. And the difference between life and death is absolute. And to be so sure of something as to pay for it with one's own death is to be very sure indeed. Our faith rests on the reality of the resurrection and not on the authenticity of the shroud. But if it is authentic, then it is the most precious relic in the universe." And many of you will recognize Caravaggio's Doubting Thomas here. The shroud is a sacred sign that leads us to sanctify our lives with the divine grace flowing from the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Perhaps our response should be like that of Doubting Thomas. My Lord and my God.
Mm.
All right, well, that moves us into the next phase now, after finishing up part 2. I can't see the chat box that the rest of you can see, so maybe Deb can interpret those for me, and I'll be glad to take questions, or unless people want to pose them by speaking, whichever the case may be.
I do have a few questions that were sent to me privately,
Okay.
and someone who had to leave early. He asked about the museum on the shroud in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he would like your comments on that.
Yes, I believe that man, his name is Peter Schumacher, and he has had it there for over a decade. At one time, it was in a shopping mall at Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he has some beautiful replicas of, for instance, to say the front part of the body, where you can see from head to toe, a photographic negative, life size, shows the backside, it shows the entire shroud. He's got a lot of information on that. Peter Schumacher was the person who worked with Dr. Jackson with the VP8 image analyzer. And he was the one that showed this to Dr. Jackson. And, they just, wow, how could that be? And that's what stimulated the STIR project. So there is one there. There is a museum in Shreveport, Louisiana, at the Cathedral of St. John Birchman's. And that is headed by Father Peter Moynihan and Dr. Cheryl White of LSU, Louisiana State University. They have a beautiful museum there. Another one recently opened up at Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Where Dollywood is at?
Yes.
Just north of, I'm trying to think of the tourist trap in Tennessee. We went there.
I know what you're referring. It's right there by Dollywood. It's right there at the entrance to Smoky Mountain National Park. Yeah.
Anyway, in Pigeon Forge, there's a museum right in the main strip there. It's opened by a man named Abrams, and he was a Baptist, and he has put up a shroud museum there. It has over 100 artifacts in it, including an actual size replica of the shroud. I understand there are less than 50 of these in the world that were commissioned by Barry Schwartz. And by the way, I must say again that on many of the slides that we saw today, I need to give credit and acknowledge my thanks to Barry Schwartz, who allowed us to use many of the pictures that we use in our presentation here. Next question.
We have a question from Frank. He says, from time to time, he says, superb presentation, Jim, with an exclamation point. From time to time, I have seen information on the history of the shroud, magazine articles, books, etc. On occasion, it has been said that there were other purported shrouds in the past, existing simultaneously. Is there any other documentation or history of these other shrouds that you are aware of? If so, do any of these other shrouds exist today?
Right. There are no other shrouds per se that exist that have a mysterious image on them. There are burial cloths that were painted. Matter of fact, in the northern area of Italy, known as Piedmont, Piedmont. It was quite common from the 16th century through the 19th century for the shroud to be copied onto linens. And imagine an artist with the shroud is laid out on one side, and to the side of him, he's got a blank cloth canvas, and he would paint a replica of the shroud and then they would lay it over on top of the shroud and bless it with holy water. It would be sanctified. It would be a sacramental. And then these shrouds were given to those people who were friends to the Savoys, and they would put them up in their houses, their castles and things. There are a couple of hundred of those, but everyone recognized that those are painted. I think what you're reading about in many of these articles referred to was the three Mendelians of Odessa. All right. In Odessa, there were three Mendelians. And in 944, one of them was brought to the royal palace in Constantinople. And it's believed that one of them later ended up in the Sainte-Chapelle Chapel in France. There's this beautiful building, perhaps you can use Mr. Moynihan, this beautiful blue Sainte-Chapelle with hundreds of artifacts in it. In the 17, and in their inventory was a Mendelian, believed to be one of these. And in the 1790s, it was missing because that was the French Revolution, and many of those artifacts were destroyed. The chapel was ransacked and never seen again. So in terms of any credibility about a shroud, this is the only one that we have that's a mysterious image. Any others were painted copies that we know are painted copies.
Okay. Someone sent a question before we began, and they wanted to know what your thoughts were on the veil of Menapello. And one idea I want to interject. You said on this presentation today
Go ahead.
That the image of the shroud was just there. It wasn't really in any fiber. It was laying basically on top, the image, correct?
The image on the shroud was what again?
You said that it was, quote, just there. It was just on top, basically, of the cloth. So it was not in the fibers.
Right. The inside of the fibers, those who were in contact with the body, were yellowed to about 0.2 of a micron, perhaps by a dehydration process. A very great burst of light, which has been estimated to be, if you took every laser on the planet and turned it on for 40 nanoseconds, that's 10 to the -8. And there's a billion nanoseconds in a second. And if you could do that, perhaps it would just dehydrate those fibers enough to produce that type of superficiality, which we can't do today. So the fibers are dehydrated and the image is just there. There's no stuff. And regarding the veil of Menapello, let's show you what we're talking about
here. The connection I wanted to make is when we go to Menapello, which is there, we're told the same thing, that the image is not on the viso, the actual cloth. It's also what I learned when I went to Guadalupe on the tilma. The image sits on top of the tilma. So these miraculous images they're miraculous.
Yes. Well, I would agree that the images are miraculous. We think the process that formed the tilma Guadalupe must have been a different process, though, because if you ever wonder what's on the backside of the tilma Guadalupe, Mary's going to be looking over her other shoulder. All right, she's looking over one shoulder in the front, and it goes all the way through, and she's looking over her other shoulder. And so it goes all the way through. The shroud doesn't do that. The shroud looks like this. Let me show you something real quick here. All right, on the left, if we do backlighting, here is the front of the shroud with light on it. Everyone can see the image, even though it's very faint. Now, if you put the light behind the shroud, then anything that penetrates the fibers is going to show up. For example, you can see the scorch marks that go deep. You can see the blood stains that go deep. You can see the water stains here. You can see these water stains very clearly. What you don't see is the image. The image is so superficial that it disappears in backlighting. And this is somewhat true of the veil of Menapello.
Exactly.
You put your hand behind the veil of Menapello, all of a sudden it jumps out at you because you've cut away the backlighting. So I would say there's a similarity between the veil of Menapello and the shroud if they were formed by that process, whereas the tilma Guadalupe goes all the way through. Okay. Getting back to your question on the veil of Menapello, let's see, what was that one here? I can answer this. This is a question about the hands people often have. This is 105. I'm jumping around here. There we go. Of course, this image shows the eyes being open, and the eyes on the shroud are closed. And so how do you account for that? Of everything I've read on the Veil of Montepello, and of course, Paul Bade, he is the expert on this, and he could give a better explanation. But it's been regarded as one of three things. Number one, was it Veronica's veil? Was this the image when she put this byssus, which is made of mollusk silk, so to speak? It's a very rare type of material, thinner than a sheet of paper. When she put this on his face on Good Friday, is this what she saw? Is this Veronica's veil? Others say perhaps this was laid on top of the shroud in the tomb, and that at the moment of the resurrection, that it was created at the same time with the eyes of the shroud being closed and the eyes of this being open. That is not as believed by as many people, but that's been proposed. And then the third could be that it's neither of those two, and it's some other type of mysterious image. I would just simply say this, in my own personal opinion, if it is not a natural process, and obviously this is not a natural process, this just doesn't happen. If you put this on someone's face, by direct contact, you'd have a wraparound distortion. So this doesn't happen naturally. Secondly, if it's not the work of an artist, and from what I've read, there is no paints or pigments to produce this, then if you rule those two possibilities out, what is left? So, I'm favorably disposed to the veil of Montepello being such a miraculous item. But I guess I would say I'm more certain about the shroud than I am about the veil, simply because that's not my area of expertise. And Paul Bade, for him, it is.
Well, we hope to bring Paul Bade on and to do a virtual pilgrimage on the Veil of Montepello. If we were to go, for those who have not been there, if we were to go to Montepello in Italy, which is about 2.5 hours towards the Adriatic from Rome, we would go into the back part where Sister Maria Petra would explain the Veil of Montepello. And there she would say to you, this image is a photograph, if you will, of the moment of resurrection when Jesus opened his eyes, which was the second possible explanation that Jim just proposed. So that's what they would say there. We do have, thank you for answering that. We do have, Marco has his hand up. Marco, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, hi, Jim.
Hello there.
Hi, it's Marco. Yeah, I'm from South Africa, and
Hey, Mark.
I love to be on the show. It's so deep, so spiritual for me. Just want to share with you and obviously confirm that what you have said in these last two presentations is absolutely beautiful and correct.
Oh,
To
blessed be
confirm
God.
that Jesus, bless you for that. And I'm sure the Lord is guiding you correctly on the right road. Jesus said to Vasula Ryden, she's a mystique, a Greek Orthodox mystique, and I think Deborah and Dr. Robert, unity will come through the unity between the Orthodox and the Catholics and the Protestants. But he said to her about the shroud in Turin, he said to her on the 2nd of October, 1987, my Holy Shroud is authentic. I've just posted on the chat show. It is I, Jesus. And I think this is where Dr. Robert was so correct in saying that we have to look at life spiritually in the eyes of our soul. Let it be known that any image of mine or my mother's is to be honored, for it represents us as my cross is representing me. Let it be known, this is what was so important to me. Let it be known that my Holy Shroud is indeed authentic. It is the same that covered me, blessed by me. Vasula, enter into my heart. Let me hide you in there. Rest, come to your Father. So your work, your hard work in all these years is so fruitful because Jesus did say it is authentic. It's not false. The Shroud of Turin is what we see there on the shroud is Jesus, rendered by God. All the chemicals that you are studying and you said, how did this image come about, was done by God. Only God can do the possible, the impossible as well. So there it is, a small little confirmation from heaven that your hard work is definitely not in vain. your hypotheses has paid for itself. So I think we also need to look, like you said, through prayer and through what we've done in your novena and everything that you've been doing is a grace from the Lord. And what you've done and your good work is definitely authentic. It's not ever, ever, ever to be discounted. Not now, not ever, not in the future. That was a gift to humanity of the existence of Jesus, and that cloth definitely comes from the image of that image of the cloth of Jesus is indeed given to us by the Lord miraculously, just like the Tilma of Guadalupe.
Well, thank you so much, Marco, for sharing that and for joining us from South Africa.
I was going to say, Deb, for those of you who perhaps didn't hear everything he said, he was passing along some heartfelt compliments of goodwill that he's so thankful for the Shroud, and he appreciates what's been going on. So for those of you that couldn't hear that, that was a quick summary. Go ahead, Deb.
Right, and he put some writings in chat, and that's what he read. So it's some writings by the seer Vasula Ryden. I believe Hilda had her hand up as well. Am I correct?
Yes, you're correct. Jim, I can't thank you enough. Had a fascination with the Shroud since I can remember. And I'm going to see about getting the book for myself and for my friend who's the one who left early. We're in Cleveland, Ohio, and this has been just a mutually enlightening thing. I want to just comment. I didn't know much about the headcloth at all. And my recollection maybe was that I just didn't even think of it as a separate cloth. And you brought that so real yesterday. As I read on shroud.com, I found fascinating that the headcloth they are believing was wrapped around his head before he came down from the cross. That's really something to think about. And that's what they did so that the spectators wouldn't be offended by what they're seeing, especially as gruesome as it might have looked. It was a Jewish consideration. So that one thing about that, and also that the description of the cloth indicates that the head was touching the right shoulder and something else, but we're very consistent with crucifixion. I mean, it really gets you, so to speak. And then I'll stop in a minute. My one question, and you might have said it early yesterday, I am fascinated by thinking of the real lives of these disciples and scared and confused followers, and that this cloth, whatever happened to it, we have later places where it was, but I'm thinking early on, it's sacred, but how did it ever just continue to be with somebody way back in that first century and not lost or not? I mean, just the confusion of it, it's a miracle in itself. Thank you for everything.
Thank you for speaking so clearly. I think everyone heard that. Basically, it was divine providence. I mean, how else could this have survived through all of these? It was in Muslim-occupied territory. It has been through more than one fire. It was probably hidden in a jar above the Cherubim Gate in Antioch for decades or centuries. And there was a large earthquake. There was a large earthquake and flood in 525 that killed over 30,000 people. And it damaged the gates. And it was in repairing those gates at Antioch that was rediscovered, I believe, in an earthenware jar and a little bit of water, the way it was folded. We know how that was folded to produce that water pattern. And it makes sense if it fit in one of those jars. I've seen the experiments on that presented at international shroud conferences. So God's ways are not our ways. And I believe that, divine providence has sustained it up to this day.
So we have two questions in chat, Jim. We have a question from another Jim. His question is, has similar research been done on Veronica's veil? Any similarities to validate both images? I know Bob could speak to this as well. For those who don't know, St. Peter's, the dome of St. Peter's, it's held by 4 columns. On the inside, one of those columns in the balcony, when you're standing at the baldacchino, which is the center, the Pope's altar, and you look up, you'll see that's where Veronica's veil is purported to be. And it's during Lent, or is it Advent, Bob? It's during Lent of every year. It's like it's the week before Holy Week, right?
Sunday before Easter, Passion Sunday.
Passion Sunday. They come out, and we've been there, and they hold Veronica's veil up from afar. Even if you're right directly below the balcony, it's from afar, and you can venerate the veil once a year. So again, the question is, any similarities to validate both images in the research on Veronica's veil?
Sure. They have put the veil of Montepello on the shroud and seen a lot of consistencies. That's been done by many scientists, and seems to be. The difficulty is that it stretches differently than linen. Byssus is a very rare material that doesn't stretch like linen. So trying to get it to line up just right, it's a little more difficult, but there are a lot of consistencies that way. The Veronica of the Vatican is what you're speaking of. The Veronica of the Vatican, the true icon of the Vatican that's displayed there, shows the eyes closed. It is a little more of a mysterious picture that's been venerated for centuries. I can only say that the veil in Montepello shows up there in the year 1506, when the St. Peter's is basically being started to be worked on. It supposedly was brought there by an angel in 1506 and pretty much remained hidden away. It's a well-kept secret. In answer to the question was, have there been many scientific studies on it? And the answer is no. There have not been very many scientific studies on the veil of Montepello. There's been a lot of photographs and trying to line things up that way. But in terms of taking a sample and trying to carbon date it, no. There's been more studies done on the Sudarium of Oviedo. So in terms of rigor, the shroud has been studied most rigorously. The Sudarium of Oviedo has been several dozen tests done on it. And the veil of Montepello has been less studied among the three, right? And what I wanted to do here, if that question was answered for you, I would like to answer some of these open questions that people might have. There are some definite facts we have about the travertine aragonite soil, the pollen grains. However, there are still 6 open questions that are legitimately debated, all right? And these are those 6 areas. When it went from Jerusalem to Constantinople, did it go through Antioch or Odessa? That's the first question they address here. All right. So this is what Dr. Jack Marquardt pointed out in his paper 2014. It seems a little more likely than this is the route that we think. The Mendelian of Odessa seems a little less likely because it's based on the idea that Jesus wrote a letter to King Abgar. And we just don't have any evidence that Jesus ever wrote anything. If you recall in the Gospels, when people needed to be cured from afar, which he did on more than one occasion, he said, "Be it done," and it happened. So Jesus happened to write a letter to say, "I'll send somebody later." It doesn't seem to hold up. Also, the Odessa hypothesis really doesn't have any documentation until the same time in the 6th century as the Odessa one, or as the Antioch. Both those stories kind of come out at the same time. And St. Jerome leans toward he held a parchment in his hand called the Lost Gospels of the Hebrews, which never became part of our canon, but some of those lost things that were not approved could still indeed hold some truth. So St. Jerome held that in his hand. So it's a little more likely. But in any event, it was in Constantinople. Whether it went through Odessa, as Ian Wilson says, or whether it went through Antioch, as Dr. Jack Marquardt has stated, and that appears to be the majority opinion of scientists right now, historians. Okay. The second question is, okay, after the sack of Constantinople, it shows up in 1355 to Geoffrey de Charnay. How did it get there? There are 3 possibilities. One could be, was it through his wife, who was the great-great-granddaughter of Othan de la Roche, who was in the 4th Crusade, all right? And he was from southern France to begin with. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that it came through the Knights Templar. This is one that's romanticized on TV documentaries a lot. The third one is that it possibly came through his mother, because his mother had a connection to Constantinople in that her father was Jean de Jonville, who was the right-hand man of Louis IX, St. Louis, right, who was the king of France in that 13th century and was on more than one crusade. His cousin was Baldwin III. Baldwin III was the emperor of Constantinople at the time of the sack of Constantinople. And on more than one occasion, St. Louis IX had to bail out Baldwin because Baldwin would want these big loans. He was in financial trouble, and he would get loans from the Venetians and others. And as collateral, he would take icons from the royal palace and give them the icon as collateral, and then tell them when he gets the loan paid back, they would give it back to him. That happened 23 times that the St. Louis IX bailed him out. And it's entirely possible that the shroud was one of these occasions where Baldwin needed money. He put it up as collateral, and St. Louis IX bailed him out. It went on to his right-hand man, Jean de Joinville, who was the mother of Joffrey de Charnay. Any one of those three is a possibility, or perhaps we know it could be something else totally different. But that's one of those open questions. It just hasn't been satisfactorily, definitively defined yet. Another question is on the carbon dating, what caused the discrepancy, all right? Now, we're certain that the carbon dating was invalid, but we don't know why. And there's three possibilities. Dr. Robert Rucker of Washington State believes it was a neutron flux of neutrons from the body that could have converted C12 into C14. Dr. Jackson believes that the carbon monoxide levels, which are rich in carbon-14, are higher lower to the ground. So depending on how the shroud was stored, that could result in a discrepancy of giving a false date. And then a third hypothesis was that this area was a result of a reweave, and that the samples actually contain a mixture of 1st century and 16th century materials. And that was put forth by Ray Rogers, Joseph Marino, and Sue Benford. So any one of those three, or combination of them, might explain the reason why the carbon dating was contaminated, okay? By the way, if you want to get a good scoop, Professor Emanuela Marinelli, she composed a paper here that describes in great detail what was going on before this test, what were the protocols supposed to be, what were the 7 labs supposed to be, all these things. There were 15 protocols that were violated. What happened before, during, and after is in this paper. And you can find that on shroud.com. Very simply, just type in search for Marinelli. That's probably the best description of what was going on there. I might add that right after that press conference, Robert, that you attended in 1988 with the Cardinal, the 3 Oxford professors, Teddy Hall, Michael Tite, and Robert Hedges, that when they presented theirs with an exclamation point, right after they did that, the Oxford University received a gift of $1 million, 1 million British pounds of solid silver, solid sterling silver. And Michael Tite, I should say Teddy Hall, who was the most outspoken person saying that this proves it's a fraud, he retired rich. Michael Tite, who directed the entire operation, he originally was the director for the British Museum of Natural History. And after this $1 million shows up, he gets promoted. They establish a history chair for him at Oxford. And this $1 million came from 40 Masons. And so you can connect the dots there yourself if you'd like. I don't have that as part of my talk because I don't want it to distract from the nature of the rest of the talk. But those are facts that can be verified. That's not hearsay. But she explains that all in this paper.
We do have one more question in chat. And it's from Teresa Bell in Canada. And she wants to know if you are aware of any upcoming planned anniversary dates for public showing of the shroud again, perhaps in the holy years to come?
Yeah, that is a great question. Pope Benedict in 2010 said he was going to display it again in 2025, which is a holy year. And then, of course, after he stepped down in 2013, the new Pope can display it whenever he wants. And so Francis displayed it in 2015 because of St. John Bosco's 200th anniversary of his birthday. I understood that Pope Francis did make comment that it would be displayed again in 2025 for the holy year. However, that could change. If he changes his mind or another Pope comes along, it could be displayed at the way we see the Tilma of Guadalupe. If they decided to put it on permanent display in the Vatican, there's nothing that would stop the Pope from making that recommendation. Right now, it's just felt to be more secure because it's very costly when they do put it on public display. It costs some money. When you go to visit the Shroud of Turin, it doesn't cost anything. They simply disperse tickets to spread the people out, but it does cost them some money to display it. So it's scheduled to be on display again in 2025, but that could change.
Well, we hope, God willing, when the next time it is displayed, that we're going to have Jim and his wife along to lead a pilgrimage to visit the Holy Shroud.
I'm excited about that. I wanted to point out one thing here. Another open question was, if radiation is the cause, there are three possibilities. The burst of light, was it photons of light that dehydrated the fibers? Was it electrons, or was it neutrons? So those are the three questions there. And I did want to point out something about the holy fire here. And I'm going to jump to that here, if you don't mind. Okay, can you all see that okay? Can you see this document on the holy fire?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me pull up something. I'll give you a second to look at that here, because I want to show you something else with this here.
So Bob, while he's doing that, you want to explain the holy fire?
Well, I can't explain the holy fire. I had it appears
Well said.
it appears at Easter in Jerusalem, in the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Jesus. What I wanted to say very quickly, just 10 seconds, if we think of King David, and we said we have the shroud of King David, everyone would be quite excited. Is that really what David was buried in, etc.? Or Tutankhamun, the Pharaoh of Egypt. What we claim with this shroud is that the King of Kings, who was executed, left physical evidence, not only of his suffering, his blood, but of his face. A lot of people don't like that idea. What we have in the careful folding of this, and we know that it's at least 700 years, that's for sure. And we know that this fabric looks very much like the fabric that was woven in Palestine 2,000 years ago. So I'm very happy that we're investigating it, but I'm very excited that people were, as Hilda talked about, they cared for this for century upon century because they thought this is the son of David, and he's the king, and we have the relics of his death. Now, the fact that in 1997 someone tried to burn down the chapel where it's kept, the fact that in 1988 they tested a corner piece and said this can't be David, it can't be Jesus, it's 1300s, and the fact that some of the testers received big grants after tells us there's a lot of people that don't want this to be known about and don't want it to be believed in. And more than that, they might want it to be destroyed. And in that sense, I have even more devotion to the Shroud of Turin. And I was there in '88 when they were testing. People were running around as if they were fleeing. They were embarrassed. And there is a group in our church and in our world which doesn't want to be regarded as believing in fables or taking sort of superstitious attitudes toward things. And some of our high-ranking churchmen want to be regarded by the world as very scientific. So whatever the science will say, they will nod their head. And in that case, in '88, they as you've so clearly demonstrated, no one really accepts those results anymore. It's a terrible fact that we took a terrific blow by yielding and acknowledging something that took us by surprise, because a lot of people believed it would be said, this is from the 1st century. So people were surprised. And now 32 years have gone by. You've done decades of work yourself, fantastic work, beautifully presented. And this will continue and be a legacy for you, and we'll continue to report on it. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Well, I want to finish up here with a thank you for that, Bob. That does enhance things. A message of hope here of could there be a connection between the Holy Fire and the Shroud of Turin? And could that be an opportunity for a closer union between the Catholics and the Orthodox, all right? And as you can see from this paper, it was published in the professional journal Archaeology and Anthropology. And Professor Giulio Fonte from the University of Padua, this was published in July of 2019. He conducted experiments at the Holy Sepulchre on Holy Saturday, about 2 p.m. in the afternoon, which is when this holy fire has been occurring for supposedly centuries, all right? On Holy Saturday, they light a candle in the sepulcher that somehow it's lit from some supernatural means that might correspond to light. You know, when you think about the apostles and the transfiguration, Jesus gave Peter, James, and John a snippet of, this is my glorified body. This is a resurrected body. And it was so bright. His face shone like the sun, and his clothing was brighter than any fuller could make it. Well, if light is somehow a mechanism for a resurrected body, that seems to fit pretty well with the image formation process of the shroud, as well as this annual event that's been happening supposedly in the Holy Sepulchre, right? And in his paper, he was following up on something that in Orthodox, there's the edicule, okay? Inside that Church of the Holy Sepulchre, at one end is the edicule built over the spot to be Christ's tomb. Now, in 2016, an Orthodox scientist measured this flame. This flame is lit by the Greek Orthodox patriarch. I should say he's inside the edicule, and the flame just spontaneously lights in some way. There's a blue haze that sometimes will be emitted from this area. And by the way, he's thoroughly checked before he goes in by actually some non-Christians to make sure this isn't some type of trick or something. And it's called the holy fire. And they found that this holy fire is just slightly warmer than body temperature in 2016. Now, Dr. Fonte confirmed this in 2019 when it was found to be 40 degrees Celsius. Our body temperature is about 38 degrees Celsius. So this feels like warm water. And he took some instrumentation with this, right? He used a spectroscope, an infrared camera, a thermometer, and an ionization thing that measures a fire. This was truly a fire, all right? And in showing you the further down the paper here, okay, there is Dr. Fonte with the holy flame. About 4 minutes after the holy flame was ignited inside the edicule through some mysterious process that we still don't understand, he got his candle lit, and 2 minutes after that, he's putting it in his beard and going all over his face, as many of the people that are lighting candles from the holy fire will do. For about 15 to 20 minutes, this flame is simply warm, about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and it causes no damage. Now, you can't fake that. Within about 20 minutes, it goes back up to about 892 degrees, which is what the temperature of the control flame was. I can show you it down here. All right, there's the edicule. This is where his instrumentation was at. This is where he got the fire lit that came out of the edicule. And they have what's called the control flame and the holy flame. And at the same time this fire is lit, they lit another fire from a typical match with the same type of candle. And both the control fire, that what we call the normal fire, and the holy fire showed the same magnetic spectrum. That what I'm making the point here is that it is truly fire. The holy fire is truly fire, but it does not consume. It does not burn. Right? And just kind of finish things down here. There it is, shows the temperatures, and I'll show you the picture. There's after 20 minutes, it's almost 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's something that I think you'll find to be fascinating, and that is that when they took the control fire and put it up to a linen cloth, it burns a hole right through it. A fire will burn cloth. But when you take the holy fire and put it up to linen, it just singes it very superficially. And Dr. Fonte says this superficiality resembles the shroud. He's saying that the holy fire in the sepulchre on Holy Saturday reacts to linen the same way, perhaps, that the Shroud of Turin image was formed. And that's a very significant connection to make here. And yet he goes on to some other experiments here, but there's the two flames again. There's no difference between what the holy fire and a control fire look the same. It's truly fire. They measure ionization. When something burns, ions are made. And just an instant before the holy fire somehow comes out of the edicule, the ionization in that area just jumps off the scale. Something happens, and it is truly a fire that's taken place. Now, here's a summary with these 7 facts here. And I just want to show you one here. It says, from this experiment, you see point number 5, he makes 7 connections between the two, between the holy flame, holy fire, that's HF, and the Turin shroud, that's TS here. So he's saying that the superficial singeing of the holy fire resembles the singeing that we see on the Turin shroud. That's just one of the points. And now I'm going to finish up here with this last two paragraphs here, which I think are very significant here. Another thing he writes, that this light does not produce shadows, difficult to explain. Okay, here's his point. Think about Moses in the burning bush. Wasn't that a fire that didn't consume? And I'm reading these last 2 paragraphs here. At this point, a fact described in Exodus comes to mind. Now Moses looked, and the bush burned with fire, but the bush was not consumed. And the following questions arise. Is there perhaps a correlation between the fire of the bush, just reported, and the holy fire? And are the fire of the bush, the holy fire, and the burst of energy supposed for the Turin shroud a sign of God? And in the end, a desire inspired by St. John Paul II considered that the holy fire was a miracle controlled by the Orthodox Church, and the Turin shroud is a miracle controlled by the Catholic Church. He points out the church must breathe with her 2 lungs. In the first millennium history of Christianity, this expression refers primarily to the relationship between Byzantium and Rome. We understand clearly that the vision of full communion to be sought is that of unity in legitimate diversity. And so I would simply close with this comment here that what if the holy fire and shroud could be a point of convergence where we could begin to come together and celebrate the same Easter? I don't think the Orthodox would have any problem with us celebrating Easter the way they do, because it seems to me they've got it right. If the holy fire truly is miraculous, then they've got Easter Sunday right. And that is not a moral concession. If the Catholics suddenly just agree to celebrate Easter when they celebrate it, we're not changing any of our doctrine. It's not a moral question. But that as a foundation could be a very great unifying element. And so unbeknownst to the rest of you, I sense kind of a connection between Dr. Moynihan and an engineer who is a friend of Dr. Fonte, who would be present at the next experiments. And perhaps that collaboration could result in that information somehow to make this come about, and what that looks like, I can't say, but I would say that I think Dr. Moynihan thinks big and Robert Seifert thinks big, and they've got connections between this holy fire and sepulcher and church and scientists. And I think it'd be wonderful if something could be worked that way, and I'll do whatever I can to assist in that. So that is my closing comments. If you have more for me, Deb, I'll be glad to speak longer.